Hello, good morning to you.
Evening of rain last night, and the sun came up bright and pretty. It's a beautiful day outside today. We're so thankful for that. Thankful it's a new day, thankful it's a new week, and it's also a new month. And so it's wild to think it's already December of 2019, but we're so thankful it's been a great year and know that it will continue to be such in the last few weeks, Lord willing. We're so thankful for all of God's good blessings upon us, and we're thankful to assemble today for the purpose of worshiping Him and thanking Him for those blessings. Thank you for being here. If you're a guest, I know that it honors us that you're here. We're so thankful for so many from the Taylor family here today. I know that they're thrilled to all be together, and we are thankful for them. If you will, turn your Bibles to James chapter 2, James, the second chapter. We'll get there shortly. Look at the reading that Brother Ted read from. Two quick announcements. I'm sure Mike will make us aware of these at the end of the service, but remember that next Sunday is our holiday meal. We always look forward to that lunch together, so be planning for that. Be preparing to be here, also planning to bring those special holiday foods to eat and enjoy together. Remember our 1 o'clock service on that same Sunday, and make plans for that. We will not have that 5 p.m. service, and what a great day that will be for us to spend time together. And then also remember the 13th, a week from Friday, is the time we've set aside to try to go see a movie at the Alabama Theater. If you have not bought your tickets for that already, it's probably a wise time to do that, as Friday night shows typically sell out pretty quickly. And so if you'll go ahead and buy those tickets online, that'll be of the best case scenario for as many of us to go together as we can. And we'll do our best to see if we can meet up or ride together somehow, if the case may be. But be making plans for that. We look forward to sharing those nights together as family. There's a young girl, going across a little ways to go see some family. She was riding a train for the first time. And so she was taking in everything new that she was experiencing. And she got to looking out her window far up ahead. She saw a big ravine. Beyond that ravine, she saw a big lake. And there was more canyon and ravine beyond that lake. And she got to noticing that the train tracks were angled directly for that ravine and for that lake. So she began to get really worried and concerned. She slumped down in her chair. She got a little nervous at her stomach. And she got scared. Well, what in the world's going to happen? I'm on this train and it's headed right for this ravine, for that body of water. So the closer and closer she got, she closed her eyes and sunk down in her chair even more. Nothing happened. She just kept riding on along as the train went on. And she looked out the window and saw that she was above the ravine and on the train tracks and was safe. She got past the ravine and she kind of looked out the window to the rear, and she smiled and she said, well, someone had got out in front of this train and built bridges over those scary places. And so we were safe. And that's a short, sweet, concise view of faith and trust in God. That to follow Him demands still scary and difficult times in our lives and scary and difficult choices often. But trusting in Him is an acknowledgement that He has, quote, built those bridges for us to be safe. Isn't it also true that some of the scariest, most difficult, most challenging times, challenging moments, are the times when we must obey and carry out His word? Don't those challenge us as much, or maybe sometimes even more, as many of the other choices we're called to make in life? And it's that type of thinking that James is addressing in James chapter 2. He's writing to Christians, and early on, from the opening words of that book, he has made it clear, your faith will cost you. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials, tests of various kinds. It's going to cost you. It's going to be difficult. What he addresses in chapter 2 is this pushback that we might give when it does get difficult, when it does challenge us, for us to somehow and step back and shirk responsibility, shirk the opportunities to work and to do the actions, and just rely on a verbal, shallow faith. He's addressing that deep faith demands obedience and constant obedience, thorough, always obedience. To do so, he first goes through some hypothetical scenarios. We'll get to that text in just a minute. But he pivots in verse 21 to look at the life of Abraham. It says, here is an example. Do you want to be shown what it's like to be justified by works? That you have to do the actions for your faith to matter, for your faith to be useful, for it to be good. He pivots and highlights, shows a portrait of the life of Abraham, specifically one moment in his life when he was justified by works, showing us that that's how God always operates. Let's read verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works. Faith was completed by his works. The scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Text is helpful to these early Christians and can be helpful today when we realize how important and how significant Abraham is for us. Directly, by bloodline, he would be considered the father of the Jews. They could trace their physical heritage back to him, so he was their father. But even for those who came out of a Gentile background, even for us today as Christians, Paul makes it clear in Galatians 3, he is still our father of the faith because we obey God in the same way he obeyed God. And so there are multiple texts that extol Abraham as an example of faithfulness that's rewarded by God's goodness and mercy. So Romans 4, Galatians 3, Hebrews 11, all highlight and portray Abraham in this vital role as one who pleased God with his faith and works working together. Our text, James, emphasizes that works aspect, not to the exclusion of faith, not the exclusion of grace or mercy, but the necessary component of works, active obedience. Now, to see that, it comes in the context of chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. The whole section talks about this dynamic of faith being shown and proven by works, justified by works even. You go back to chapter 2, verse 14. Listen how he opens this. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? The ESV does a good job of including the article in that verse. Can that faith save him? See, these Christians, early Christians, would have known what it took. They would have known when they were saved, when they obeyed. And so now James is pointing to a time later in their lives. They've already obeyed to become Christians, and now he's writing difficult things to them. And he says, is that the type of faith that would save a person? They would quickly say, well, no, that's not saving faith. So now he goes on to address how important this is to keep living, not just with faith and trust, but living with works of obedience, submission, that work with and pair with that trust. You'll notice if you read throughout the text, chapter 2, leading up to our text about Abraham, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, notice the emphasis on the word say and concepts that deal with sight, the word see or the words show. If you go back through the beginning, verse 14, when James is offering kind of the false view, he's offering their hesitations, he's portraying their justification for avoiding these good works. He'll talk about saying. It's because they're empty words. What good is it, verse 14, if someone says he has faith but not have works? Verse 16, if one of you says to a poor person, a hungry person, I hope you get your food, I hope you get your clothes. What good does saying actually help them? Someone will say, verse 18, you have faith and I have works. You see it? James is saying, you may claim faith, but true faith, faith that God rewards, faith that God justifies, is always a visible faith. Notice how he does that in this text. Verse 18, picking up, someone will say, you have faith, I have works. He then says, show me your faith apart from works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You'll always come up empty if you try to separate the two, but I am instead going to show you that they are inseparable. I will show you my faith by my works. Verse 20, a key verse. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? There again is the word show, the word see. It's active, it's in action. But it also speaks to the attitude. Do you really desire to see that true faith is always an active faith? Do you want to be shown this? And then on the basis of that question, do you want to be shown, he then pivots to Abraham and says, here's Abraham, this example of godly faith, but godly faith that always works. Godly faith that is justified even by works. So you look at that text, verse 21 beginning. He says, verse 22 then, you see that faith was active along with his works. And then verse 24, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And so he's setting up this construction to lead into the Abraham example. You can talk a big game. You can talk about faith. You can talk about believing in Jesus Christ. But that is not a faith that honors God or that pleases God or that is rewarded by God. Instead, it must be faith that is spoken, yes, but is just as consistently and just as dependently lived out. It lives out, chooses works of obedience and submission to God. Using Abraham as his example, when does God justify? When did God justify Abraham? A question of time. He says it, verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? He says it's when. It's a verbal form. Having offered up Isaac. That's the when. That's the timeline. Abraham trusted. Abraham had this desire. But God blessed it. God justified him and honored his faith when he acted, when he submitted, when he obeyed the command. It's an important thing for us to notice on the timeline. But third, notice the phrase active along with. That's verse 22. You see, his faith was active along with his works. They were working together is the literal Greek verb there. It's only used a handful of times in the New Testament, but it literally means working together. And I almost can guarantee almost all of us are familiar with that verb because Paul uses it in Romans chapter 8. In verse 28, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. He says Abraham had a life that was not just faith in word only or thought only, but it was complete trust and it was complete physical obedience, always working together. He was justified by his works when he complied with God's command to offer up Isaac. They were working together. Paul will use the term again in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 1. Working together with him then, we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. He's just referenced God and the salvation he's offered, the reconciliation he's offered through Christ there at the end of 2 Corinthians 5. So he's saying here, we as his messengers, as apostles and preachers and teachers, we are working together with God to plead with you to not receive his grace in vain. Paul is saying we're working together. Two parties, us and God, are working together. If we were to pull one of those parties out of the equation, they stop working together. It's no longer God working through human messengers. It's no longer the same setup that God designed. If you take faith, you take works, and you pull either one out of the equation, if we render either one unnecessary, it ceases to be the kind of living or the kind of faith that God justifies. They're both necessary. They're both constantly working together, and God justifies, saves when we obey him. Now, why is this so important for James to address? If that's kind of heady, kind of deeper theological concepts, why would James pause in chapter 2 to address these things? It seems pretty clear. It's because he understands, and God is understanding and inspiring James along the way, to be sure we understand these things are difficult. And you know the quickest loophole, the quickest way for us to kind of get around doing some of these difficult commands? We're going to face those difficult trials of chapter 1, beginning of verse 2. We're going to face difficult decisions. We've got to bridle our tongues. We've got to keep our hearts pure. We've got to take care of those orphans, those widows who are difficult to take care of, who cannot take care of themselves. Chapter 2, you'll notice he's emphasized in the opening paragraph this idea of not showing partiality. He says it's much easier to show preference to those who are rich than to help those who are poor and to treat them all the same. Do we know how difficult and challenging it is for us to treat every person the same? That's why Jesus went around preaching, love your enemies. If you want to be complete and perfect like your Heavenly Father is, you'll view every person and treat every person the same. That's hard. You see how it's a quick loophole for us to try to get out of that and say, well, I can't quite do that, but at least I have faith. At least I claim Jesus. At least I claim God. At least I go to church. And because I can say that, then I can kind of get out of doing some of these difficult actions. So James is having to address the same manner in which God saves on that first day is the same manner in which we must keep living every subsequent day forward, even as the tests continue. So now you see especially how important Abraham is of an example of that. He's been following God for decades, and now that faith and trust is put even to an ultimate test. This text in no way limits or waters down or demeans grace from God's angle. And this text in no way limits or demeans our faith and trust. All three are necessary components. What does lessen and demean God's grace or even our faith is to try to hide behind our faith to get out of doing works. And it's that attitude that James is cutting off and trying to keep us from ever developing. That we say and we claim with boldness the name of Jesus and faith in Him. But we just as boldly and just as deeply commit to living out the works even when it is costly. That's why he turns to Abraham as an example, a portrait of one who has an active faith. So what will we learn if we turn to Genesis 22 in our time remaining? What can we see if we look at the actual text of Genesis 22 when Abraham carries Isaac to offer him up? Now, I'm guessing that a lot of us are familiar with this text of Genesis 22. I'd invite you to turn there. But if you've never read it, or just maybe pretend for a moment that you've never read it. If you read James, you might assume he actually killed Isaac, wouldn't you? That's a powerful picture of the level of devotion that Abraham had to God, that James would summarize this instance and summarize this moment and say, when Abraham offered him up, we know that God intervened and kept him from killing Isaac, but his faith was so strong that the legacy is, it's as if he went through with it. Genesis 22, let's begin reading verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham, said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Quickly, but I think for some very important ideas here. Notice there's several parallels to this text when Abraham is, quote, called to go sacrifice Isaac, commanded to go sacrifice Isaac. Very similar ideas overlap and parallel back to his original call in chapter 12. We're introduced to Abram at the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12, it tells him to go to this land that I will show you. So chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to a land that I will show you. You'll notice in both texts, the beginning of chapter 22, the beginning of chapter 12, decades prior, Abraham is commanded to forsake, to leave, to give up precious family. Leave the land you're in, leave your family behind and go to a land that I've shown you. Chapter 22, he's told to go kill, to go offer, sacrifice his beloved son. We have to remember always that faith is indeed costly. And very often what it costs us are the things that are most precious to us. Am I willing to part with anything for the sake of pleasing and obeying my God? That's the level of active faith Abraham displays. But a second comparison between the two, both instances, he does not find out all of the information. It's almost verbatim between the two passages. Chapter 12, verse 1, go to a land that I will show you. I'm not telling you now. I'm not telling you the coordinates in your GPS just yet. Just go, and I'll show you later. Take your son Isaac up to Moriah, and then I'll later will show you the mountain on which you're supposed to sacrifice him. We recognize that faith and trust in him will demand that we do not always have the information we wish we did. That it's going to involve leaving some questions, the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, unanswered. But God still commands and still expects our works of obedience, to be in submission to him. But third, maybe most significantly, there's an element of what would seem to be impossible in both passages. If you keep reading in chapter 12, you find that's when God makes this promise to Abraham, where he says, out of your seed, I will make of you a great nation. And he describes how great it is by saying it will be too many to count. Why is that impossible? Well, it's because at the end of chapter 11, he's just given the lineage of Abraham's father and parents and all these siblings. And he says, Sarah, Abraham's wife, was barren. She had no child. So you have this great couple, Abraham and Sarah. They're going to be this held up as this example of faith. And you have God making a promise to make a mighty nation out of them, and there's no son. There's the element of what would on the surface appear to be impossible. Well, that promise God renews 2 more times. Chapter 15 and then again in chapter 18 of Genesis. So now you get to chapter 22, and you see God's promises at work. You see that Romans 8:28 concept of all things working together for good. There's a son. Well, clearly this son is supposed to give that mighty nation life. God says, go kill him. Give me that son on an altar. Before he's had a chance to begin this mighty nation, give him up. See, the promise is still in effect. No doubt, that's the part of this emotional element, and no doubt the part of which this is indeed a test. God says, you may look at this on the surface, and it seem impossible. When it seems difficult, when it does seem impossible, will you choose obedience anyway? That's why James leverages this account so beautifully for our benefit, to challenge us to come to scenarios even when we don't have the information, and even when it seems as though this is not going to work out. We choose obedience through trust and faith above all. But next in this text, what does Abraham do when he responds? Look at verse 3 of Genesis 22. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, arose and went to the place of which God had told him. The very next morning, what do we see? We see complete trust. How do we know? Because we see thorough action. In verse 3 alone, there are 6 verbs that Abraham does. You see it? He rose, he saddled, he took the servants and Isaac. He cut, he arose, he went. Active faith, active trust. You think Abraham went to bed early that night? Think he slept well that night? He didn't hit the snooze button the next morning, though. He didn't go hide in the closet when it was time to get out and go take Isaac. He arose early because he was committed fully to obedience. Then verse 5, he tells these servants of his, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. So far, to this point, through verse 5, Abraham has vocalized his faith and trust. But you notice we've not yet got to the point at which James would say this is when Abraham was justified by works. He's got good intentions. He's made the plans. He has the desires. But what happens in the verses that follow? Look at verse 9. They came to the place. Abraham built the altar. He laid the wood in order. He bound Isaac. He laid him on the wood on the altar. He reached out his hand. He took the knife to slaughter his son. 8 additional verbs in verses 9 and 10. And it's verses 9 and 10 that we could circle And go back to James chapter 2 and verse 21 and circle the word when. When Abraham offered Isaac happened in verses 9 and 10. Abraham followed through and carried it out. And it was in that moment that God responded. His messenger spoke up and said, don't harm the boy, for now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son from him. You hear that? You hear that praise by God through his messenger? Upon his actions, he praises his fear, his reverent, submissive trust based on his actions. And thus, he's an example for us to be sure we are not hiding behind a verbal, shallow faith in order to avoid doing works and doing the things that we must do as God's children, as Christians. As we think about what that would have cost, we easily and quickly and rightfully so think about how emotional of a moment this would have been. I mean, you just think through all that Abraham and God have went through with just Isaac alone. Can't you hear Abraham saying, you know, God, when you chose me, we were barren then. You knew what you were getting when you chose us. You still made those promises to us. And then you're the one that gave us this son, and now you're asking me to give it all up? You could hear the tension. You could hear the possibility for Abraham to push back on such a strong command. And yet he responds to that fear, responds to that tension, not with justification, not with trying to get out of it, not with an alternative, not with bargaining, but with obedience, submissive, humble, reverent obedience. But also think about this in terms of Abraham's legacy. Abraham was not a poor man. He was not just some average person. He was wealthy. He was a model of self-sufficiency if there ever has been one. He had to move all these herds and servants when he would be moving around to follow God's path. He had a military presence of his own. He had soldiers under his care. He was wealthy and rich. He was a model of self-sufficiency. Don't you think that was clearly possible for him to have leveraged that when God says, go kill your son? Hold up, God, this son is all I needed you for. And now you're going to take it away? Nope, I'm going to keep it to myself. You find another way. Can't you see if we're thinking with the flesh, if we're not acting out of faith, because of his self-sufficiency, how quickly he could have justified getting out of sacrificing Isaac that day? But one more thing to consider from this text, the phrase, God will provide, certainly one that we're familiar with. It's that text, it's the phrase that Abraham first tells Isaac in that heartbreaking question. I mean, on the list of questions I hope he doesn't ask, that may have been near the top for Abraham. Isaac says, Dad, you've got everything you need except for the sacrifice. Where's it at? And in faith and confidence, Abraham simply says, God will provide. When God does intervene and provides the ram in the thicket, Abraham continues that worship and praise of God, and he names that place by the same name. God will provide. It's on this spot that God provided. The background of that phrase is interesting. The most literal kind of root of the word for God will provide has to do with sight. Seeing. In our vernacular today, sometimes we say we're going to see to it that this happens. Or maybe somebody's in charge of something and we're going to see it through unto completion. Think about how that gives some freshness to what Abraham is saying to Isaac. God is going to see. Well, where's the sacrifice? Well, God is going to see to it. What a powerful phrase, and what a helpful phrase maybe even for us to think about in terms of verbalizing and thinking about faith. But here's the danger. Oftentimes we flip the script from what Abraham did. Abraham took a command of God. He heard it. It was clear. It was simple. But it was difficult. And it was not even really as complete as he would like for it to be, and I'm sure as we would like for them to be. And he obeyed it anyway and said, all those other things, God will see to it. If we're not careful, we tend to do the opposite. We tend to avoid the command. We tend to avoid responsibility. And then we sit back and we hope, well, God will still see to it. because at least I believe in him. That's not the faith and the works that James are describing in chapter 2 that pleases God, justified by God. Instead, it's complete obedience that does not flinch, knowing God will see to it and God will see us through it when we, and because we are trusting in him and when we are obedient to him in all things. As we move to a close this morning, how can we apply this? How can we move forward doing better with these things? And maybe if we go back in our minds to that construction from chapter 2 where James says, if you're a foolish person, if you're trying to defend yourself and justify yourself from not doing works, you're going to say you have faith. You say you have faith. You say. Instead, you must do. You must show your faith. What if we began by listening to our self-talk? And what are the works? What are the things of obedience that we are constantly justifying getting out of? So think to your own self-talk, listen to ourselves. What is it that I'm rationalizing not doing? What is it that I'm trying to justify that I know I need to be doing, that I maybe am doing and need to stop? Can I catch myself thinking and talking to myself in such a way that reveals, there are some works, some things of obedience that God expects of me, and I need to be deeper in my faith such that I will carry them out, live them out. Maybe a good way for us to start making a list. Listen to our excuses. Listen to our justifications. What are those hiding and trying to delay that we know we need to obey in order to please God? Maybe this morning the thing that you've been wrestling with, the thing that you've been justifying, the thing that you've been putting off is to give your life to the Lord. You know you need to obey the gospel, but you've been waiting. Please know that today is the best day to do that. It's the best decision you can make, and it's the best day to make it. Would you obey him? Give your life to him where we will immerse you into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. And that's where he saves, when he saves, to then raise you to walk in a new life that lives with those good works, those new good works that please him. Please know it would thrill us to help you make that decision today. Help us, let us know if we can help you in any way. It may be that you need to come back to him. You've not been living in those good works. You've had a verbal faith, but it's been a shallow faith. It's not been active. You can change that today. You don't have to wait and put it off. We plead with you. If you need that help, please know we stand here ready to help you. If you need that help, would you come as we sing together?